For centuries, one illusion has clung to our imagination: the Ottoman harem, seen as a realm of love and desire where the most beautiful women in the world spent their days dancing, singing, and dreaming beneath golden domes. Movies, novels, and even the wild rumors of Renaissance Europe all fed this fantasy, an enchanted vision of Topkapi Palace as the beating heart of eternal romance within the mightiest empire of its age. But this was only a mask. A golden mask, hiding within it blood, tears, and schemes so ruthless that even the most powerful trembled. Prepare yourself, because what we are about to uncover is not a tale of passion, but of bloody politics. In the harem, marriages, glances, and smiles were never accidents. Every gesture, every fleeting touch could determine the fate of millions of subjects, and even the survival of the empire itself. And once the veil is lifted, you will see, love in the Ottoman world was never what it seemed. It was a torch, one that could illuminate, but also consume everything in its fire. Imagine yourself stepping through the grand gates of Topkapi. The air is heavy with sandalwood, incense, and resin drifting from the east. White marble corridors glitter under the glow of oil lamps. Everything whispers of endless luxury. But listen more closely. Beneath the faint strum of a lute and the murmur of fountains, another sound echoes, whispers. They flow through the harem like an underground river. These are not words of affection, but invisible blades, sharper than any Damascus sword. In this world, beauty was not just a gift, it was a weapon. A glance at the right moment could spare a son from execution. A misplaced smile could doom an entire family. For the women behind the walls of the harem, love was never a private longing. It was the costliest currency, traded in power, in thrones, and sometimes in the blood of their own children. We often speak of an emperor's love as a grand romance for the ages. But in the Ottoman court, love was only the first battlefield. It was the key that opened a labyrinth where every step was a trap, and the jewel-encrusted walls served only to conceal the corpses of those who lost. And the deeper you wandered, the clearer it became. The empire's most romantic legends were also its bloodiest tragedies. So when we speak of Hürrem Sultan, the concubine who rose to become the wife of Suleiman the Magnificent, do not mistake her for an Eastern Cinderella. Behind the emperor's devotion, behind her enigmatic smile, lay calculations that led to the deaths of princes, shook the palace to its core, and permanently reshaped the workings of one of history's greatest empires. Ask yourself, was it love or simply a pawn on the chessboard of power? And if it was a pawn, then who, if anyone, could ever survive until the end? To understand the story of Hürrem and Suleiman, we first need to step into the Ottoman harem, a world both dazzling and suffocating, where everything was wrapped in silk and gold, yet every breath carried the scent of danger. From the outside, the harem looked like a paradise, filled with the most beautiful women gathered from every corner of the empire and beyond, living among turquoise-tiled walls, Persian carpets as soft as clouds, and fountains that sang day and night. But behind that glittering facade, the harem was a battlefield without gunfire, where beauty and wit became weapons of survival, and where sweet smiles often hid fatal daggers. In the 16th century, Westerners imagined the harem as nothing more than the Sultan's playground, a place where he picked a girl at random each night and forgot her the next morning. But the truth was far more complex. Every woman in the harem was more than a servant. She was a pawn in a ruthless political game. Their bodies, their affections, and most of all, the sons they bore, were tools in the struggle for the throne. A woman who gave the Sultan a son might gain a foothold in the power structure. But if she failed, or if her son lost in the succession struggle, the price could be her life and the life of her child. It was into this dangerous world that a young slave girl from Ruthenia, today's Ukraine, arrived. Her birth name was likely Anastasia or Alexandra, but in the harem she was given a new one, Hürrem, the cheerful one, the bringer of joy. To Europeans, she became known as Roxolana. Born into obscurity, captured in a raid, and sold into slavery, no one could have imagined that this girl would go on to rewrite the history of the Ottoman Empire. At first, Hürrem was just one among hundreds of faces in the harem, notable only for her irrepressible optimism and unforgettable smile. And perhaps that was exactly what caught Suleiman's attention. In 1520, When he had just ascended the throne, the young sultan stood at the helm of a vast empire, stretching from Central Europe to Arabia, from North Africa to the Caucasus. He lacked nothing, least of all women. Yet in a sea of cautious glances and calculated gestures, Hürrem's unrestrained radiance must have seemed like a breath of fresh air. What began as a single night soon turned into regular summons. But what set Hürrem apart was not merely her beauty, but her intelligence and ambition. She understood that beauty alone would never be enough. To survive, she needed to become irreplaceable, not just in Suleiman's bed, but in his heart and eventually in his government. Every word she spoke, every joke she told, was not only to entertain, but to convince the Sultan that she was his confidant, the one who understood him better than anyone else. What no one expected was that Suleiman, famed for his majesty and decisiveness, would fall completely under her spell. He broke with centuries of tradition, freeing Hürrem from slavery and marrying her as his lawful wife. This was unprecedented. Previous sultans had avoided legal marriage with concubines, and the custom dictated that once a prince came of age, his mother left Istanbul to live with him in the provinces, ensuring that no single woman could wield lasting influence at court. With their official marriage, Hürrem shattered this delicate balance of power. The decision sent shockwaves through the empire. Statesmen were stunned, nobles outraged, conservatives scandalized. How could a foreign slave become Haseki Sultan, the official queen? But Suleiman did not care. He not only loved Hürrem, he trusted her completely. She became his advisor, his companion, his partner in the burdens of rule. And with this new position, Hürrem began to carve out a political influence no woman in the harem had ever wielded before. If their story had remained a private romance, history might have been gentler. But their love was political, and that made it dangerous. Hürrem quickly realized that protecting her own position meant safeguarding the future of her sons. And to do that, she had to eliminate rivals. Above all, Prince Mustafa, Suleiman's eldest son by another consort, Mahidevran. Mustafa was everything her sons were not, the empire's golden heir, beloved by the army, backed by powerful statesmen. His very existence threatened the survival of Hürrem's children. Thus, the love between Suleiman and Hürrem became the lever of decades of political intrigue. Hürrem persuaded Suleiman to grant her the unprecedented right to remain in Istanbul, rather than being sent away with her sons, ensuring she could stay at the very heart of the empire's power. From there, she built alliances, influenced appointments, and even touched the realm of foreign policy. Imagine it. In an empire forged by the sword and governed by iron law, a former slave woman, armed only with her wit, beauty, and the Sultan's favor, could make the empire's greatest men bow their heads. Beyond politics, she commissioned public works, mosques, schools, hospitals, baths, casting herself as a benevolent queen mother, beloved by the people. It was charity, yes, but also strategy, weaving her name into the very fabric of Suleiman's golden age. The love between Suleiman and Hürrem, then, was not simply romance. It was a political bombshell. It demolished the walls that had long kept the Ottoman system in balance. From that moment on, the harem was no longer just the Sultan's private quarters. It became a hidden center of power, where whispered words could carry the weight of imperial decrees. And this is why their story marks a turning point. Before Hürrem, the mothers of princes were bound by custom, exerting only indirect influence. After Hürrem, women could rule through love, through proximity to the Sultan, and through the sons they fought to raise to the throne. The precedent she set opened the door to the Sultanate of Women, a century-long era in which imperial consorts shaped the empire's destiny. In the soft glow of the harem's oil lamps, it looked like a love story. But in the cold shadows of the palace corridors, it was a silent revolution. A slave became a queen. A queen became the empire's second sovereign. And from that moment on, the Ottoman world would never be the same. If the story of Hürrem and Suleiman shook the marble walls of Topkapi, then the tragedy of Shehzada Mustafa was the crack that could never be mended in the empire's heart. A gifted prince, beloved by the people, the man destined to be the next great sultan, was struck down not by foreign steel on the battlefield, but by the hand of his own father. Driven by whispers, suspicions, and schemes woven in the shadowed corners of the harem. Mustafa, the eldest son of Suleiman and Mahidevran, embodied hope itself. From a young age, he showed the qualities of a leader: bravery, fairness, and charisma that soldiers and officials alike longed to see in a future sultan. He commanded men in campaigns, endured the same hardships as his troops, and earned their fierce devotion. To them, Mustafa was not merely a prince, but the Sultan of tomorrow. And that, precisely, was what made him a deadly threat. To Hürrem, Mustafa was the sword hanging above the heads of her own sons. She knew too well the brutal law of succession in the Ottoman dynasty. When one prince ascended the throne, his brothers were often killed to prevent civil war. If Mustafa became sultan, her children would not survive. His very existence was a death sentence suspended over her family. Thus, within the gilded walls, an invisible war began, not fought with swords, but with words, suspicions, and whispers fed into Suleiman's ear like drops of poison. Mahidevran, Mustafa's mother, saw this with painful clarity. Once Suleiman's most favored consort, once the woman who held sway over the harem, she had believed the future was secured for her son. But Hürrem's arrival changed everything. The two women became rivals locked in a deadly balance, one fighting to defend what she already had, the other fighting to claim a future for her bloodline. Between them, Mustafa became more than a son. He was both a beacon of hope and a thorn that had to be removed. In the midst of this, Suleiman's jealousy and fears only deepened. Whispers reached him that Mustafa, adored by the army, might be plotting rebellion. Rumors spread that high officials secretly backed the prince, that the court itself might tilt toward Mustafa and reduce the sultan to a figurehead. Where these whispers began, history does not say. But the shadow of Hürrem loomed over it all. With allies such as the Grand Vizier Rustam Pasha, she spun webs of intrigue, steadily feeding Suleiman's doubts drop by drop. For Suleiman, it was torment without end. On one hand, he loved Mustafa, seeing in him the reflection of his own youth. On the other, he could not dismiss the fear that such love might turn into betrayal. The Ottoman throne had long been haunted by princely uprisings, by brothers and sons who turned against one another. The specter of rebellion hovered constantly over the dynasty. And now, that specter bore the face of Mustafa. The tragedy reached its peak during the Persian campaign of 1553. Mustafa, 30 years old, was summoned to his father's tent. They say he walked in with head held high, trusting in the bond of blood, trusting that his father would recognize his loyalty. But inside, waiting for him, were the Sultan's eunuch guards. It was a trap with no escape. Chroniclers tell us Mustafa fought to his last breath. With desperate strength, he struggled against those ordered to strangle him, but fate had already been sealed. He died in the hands of men who had once served his father, not for treason, but for suspicion. Outside, the army fell into silence. Many wept, many burned with anger, but none dared speak. They knew that even grief could be taken as defiance against the Sultan. Mustafa's death was more than personal loss. It was a mortal wound to Suleiman's image. The great conqueror who had expanded his empire now stood as the man who killed his own son over whispers. To the soldiers and the people, he was no longer the perfect symbol of justice, but a ruler swayed by fear and love, twisted into paranoia. For Mahidevran, it was utter ruin. She lost her only son with a claim to the throne, lost her standing at court, lost everything. Her hatred toward Harem became an unquenchable fire. Within Topkapi, Harem had achieved what she desired. Her sons were no longer directly threatened. Yet the victory brought no light, only deeper shadows across the harem. Whispers of her role in Mustafa's downfall spread endlessly. She had not wielded the strangler's cord, but it was her words, her networks of rumor, that paved the way to his death. Hürrem became a symbol of ruthless ambition, the woman who would sacrifice even the empire's brightest prince to secure her children's survival. From then on, cracks spread through the Ottoman order. Mustafa's death eroded the trust of many officials, and soldiers no longer believed in the fairness of the court. The royal family itself descended further into bitter rivalries, where blood ties meant little and ambition was everything. The tragedy of Mustafa revealed a painful truth. Within the Ottoman harem, unconditional love did not exist. Neither pure fatherly affection nor maternal devotion could withstand the weight of the throne. A father could kill his son for power. A mother could ignite the death of that son to protect her lineage. And when Mustafa's blood seeped into the earth, the empire understood that even the dynasty itself was not spared from the cruelty of power. From that moment, jealousy and ambition cloaked Suleiman's reign. An empire that seemed invincible on the battlefield was slowly tearing itself apart behind perfumed curtains and silken walls. And in the heavy silence that followed Mustafa's death, one question lingered. Perhaps the greatest enemy of the Ottoman Empire was never beyond its borders, but deep within the heart of the Sultan's own family. If Hürrem Sultan's story opened an unexpected doorway for female power within the Ottoman harem, then the decades following her death turned that doorway into a wide and lasting path. Women once dismissed as slaves or mere instruments of pleasure became true political actors. The Ottoman Empire, built on the foundations of military might and male authority, slowly entered a strange and almost unbelievable phase, the Kadınlar Sultanate, or Sultanate of Women. It was a dynasty within a dynasty, where the throne was often shaped not by warriors who wielded swords on the battlefield, but by those who mastered whispers, well-timed tears, and an irresistible form of soft power. The harem had always been bound by thousands of rules: how a concubine walked, how far her eyes could wander, even when silence was required to survive dangerous moments. Yet once Hürrem disappeared, that world did not return to its old order. Instead, it became a stage, and every woman was forced to play the lead role or fade away entirely. Among them, one name rose beyond all convention: Hürrem Sultan. Born in Greece, on the very edge of the empire, far from Istanbul's palaces and its religious or political rituals, she was originally named Anastasia. Her name had nothing to do with the glittering halls of Topkapi. Captured in a raid and sold into slavery, her arrival at the harem was nothing short of a cruel joke played by fate. Yet from this unlikely beginning, Hürrem proved what Ottoman history would never forget. Nothing is more dangerous than a mind that observes carefully and a heart that waits patiently. In the harem, beauty was a fleeting weapon, but intelligence could endure forever. Hürrem was not only beautiful, she quickly learned Turkish, mastered the rules, and even absorbed the subtleties of politics without a single tutor. She became the favorite of Sultan Ahmed I, and eventually rose to the rank of Valid Sultan once her son ascended the throne. Unlike others who were content with symbolic influence, Hürrem demanded more. She involved herself directly in appointments, in shaping financial policy, and even in choosing the next sultan when the throne was left vacant. Ottoman chroniclers recalled that for a time, every major decision had to pass through Hürrem, from campaigns against Persia to the details of court ceremonies. When her son was too young to rule, she acted as regent, governing the empire in his name. This was the turning point. Women of the harem had moved from silent figures behind the curtain to rulers in all but name, directing an empire that stretched from North Africa to the Balkans. Hürrem's rise set off a chain reaction. The harem ceased to be merely a world of affection and favoritism. It became a battlefield of politics. Other women learned the same lesson. To survive and to secure their children's futures, they could not simply wait for fortune. Handan Sultan, Safiye Sultan, and others emerged in turn, weaving alliances and waging shadow wars as ruthless as any fought on open ground. Picture a child ascending the throne, too young to grasp strategy or finance, while women in silks behind the screens controlled the fate of millions. One mother sought to protect her son's crown, while a grandmother fought to secure guardianship and preserve her influence, and concubines schemed to advance their own sons as heirs. The harem became a giant beehive, each queen bee ready to eliminate rivals to ensure her power. Handan Sultan, wife of Mehmed III and mother of Ahmed I, wielded great authority in her time. Yet her influence was challenged by Safiye Sultan, Mehmed III's mother, a woman once described as an uncrowned queen for her ability to steer politics through her ties with Venice and Europe. Safiye, for years, virtually dominated both the harem and the court, angering many high officials. Handan, as Valid Sultan, could not stand idle, and tensions between these two powerful generations of women set off ripples of conflict that shook the palace. Their struggle was not limited to whispers behind veils. It bled into real policy. Safiye used her influence to manipulate trade with the West, reaping vast profits from Venice. Handan countered by embedding her allies into government and gradually purging Safiye's loyalists. It was nothing less than a harem Cold War. No swords or guns, only intrigue, bribery, and betrayal. The Sultanate of Women lasted nearly a century, leaving a permanent mark on Ottoman history. It proved that even in a militarized patriarchal empire, women could exploit cracks in the system to rise and even to dominate. Yet this power was a paradox. It stabilized the throne in turbulent times, while also binding the empire to the private struggles of the harem. When women ruled, their sharp instincts sometimes saved the dynasty, but jealousy and ambition often turned the throne into a dangerous toy, tearing unity apart. The most iconic figure of this era was undoubtedly Hürrem Sultan. She was admired by the people for her fairness and wisdom, yet her life ended in tragedy. When her son came of age and no longer needed her regency, he turned against her. One fateful night, her enemies within the harem orchestrated her murder. The woman who had governed an empire with delicate hands was devoured by the very world she once ruled. Her death stood as a warning. Anyone who entered this game of power would eventually face the blade turned back upon themselves. The very existence of the Sultanate of Women presented a historical paradox. It revealed the strength, intelligence, and capacity for manipulation women could wield without ever drawing a sword. At the same time, it exposed the fragility of a system so reliant on personal rivalries. A vast empire that once terrified Europe could be pushed to the brink of crisis because of battles fought between mothers, sons, grandmothers, and heirs. Perhaps the most haunting image of this era is not only the names of Kosem or Safiye, but the spectacle of a glorious empire shaken by women who never stepped beyond the walls of the harem. It is history's cruel irony. While men fought wars at the borders, the throne itself was steered by female hands, hands that society had never intended to hold power at all. If the rise of Hürrem and Kosem Sultan had once turned the Ottoman harem into a hidden court of power, then the story of Ibrahim branded by history as Ibrahim the Mad, marks the beginning of an era of decline, where passion, lust, and the private terrors of a single ruler dragged an empire into darkness. The splendor of Suleiman now seemed like nothing more than a distant memory, drowned beneath grotesque spectacles inside the harem, where the Sultan himself became a prisoner of his own desires and fears. Ibrahim was born into uncertainty. He did not grow up in the light, but in the suffocating shadows of the cafes, the cage where princes were confined, a place where each day was a gamble between life and death. As a child, he witnessed his brothers being executed to eliminate threats to the throne. His survival was itself an anomaly, but the price was his sanity, slowly eroded until his mind became a labyrinth of paranoia. Years of confinement blurred the line between reality and illusion, with fear seeping into his very bones, shaping him into a figure history could only call mad. When Ibrahim was finally released from the cafes and placed on the throne in 1640, he was like a prisoner thrust into an alien world. He distrusted everyone, even his closest confidants. His deepest obsession was with the harem, a place that for previous sultans had been both a sanctuary of pleasure and a carefully tuned political machine. For Ibrahim, however, it became a stage upon which his inner chaos played out, a site where he experimented with cruelty, delusion, and violence. It is said that Ibrahim drowned himself in beauty, not out of simple indulgence, but to fill the void gnawing inside his mind. He gathered hundreds of concubines, squandering immense wealth in his hunt for the perfect woman. Once he ordered all the women of the harem thrown into the sea on suspicion of infidelity. In another chilling tale, he forced some of his overweight concubines to gorge themselves until their bodies swelled unnaturally, declaring them symbols of abundance and imperial might. Under Ibrahim, the harem ceased to be a realm of whispers and intrigue, transforming instead into a grotesque theater where diseased appetites were gilded with luxury. But the tragedy extended beyond the silk curtains of the harem. Ibrahim's instability seeped into the empire itself. He distrusted his viziers, constantly dismissing high officials and elevating sycophants devoid of ability. Real power shifted into the hands of women within the palace, especially his mother, the Valid Sultan, and a few favored concubines. The government became a maze of selfish rivalries, where decisions of war and peace could be swayed by bedroom intrigues rather than statecraft. In this climate, love, or rather lust, turned into a weapon. Concubines, once seen as ornaments, became spies, brokers, even assassins, A smile or a whispered vow could secure state secrets or condemn a vizier to death. Affairs inside the harem were no longer private entanglements but daggers hidden in sleeves, ready to strike the moment someone faltered. Some concubines were suspected agents of Persia or Venice, infiltrating the sultan's bed to manipulate military strategies. Others staged false romances designed to destroy rivals at court. Poisoned wine, tainted fruit, or even a kiss could carry death. What had once been games of passion became lethal instruments of power. The contrast with Suleiman's reign was stark. Where Suleiman was remembered for wisdom, military genius, and a legendary love affair with Hürrem that reshaped the empire, Ibrahim was remembered only for madness, sexual obsessions, and chaos within the harem. From grandeur, the empire slid into crisis, menaced abroad by enemies and corroded within by division. Yet to place the blame solely on Ibrahim is to miss the deeper truth. His reign exposed the fragility of a system where female influence in the harem, once a delicate instrument of balance, became a double-edged sword. In the hands of figures like Hürrem or Kösem, this power had preserved stability, though often at great personal cost. But under the shadow of a deranged sultan, it devolved into a force of ruin, a mirror reflecting the empire's own decay. The age of Ibrahim the Mad revealed not just one man's downfall, but the weakness of the Ottoman system itself. An empire that once commanded the Mediterranean was now mocked across Europe. Tales of a lunatic sultan and his depraved harem spread across the continent, turning the once mighty Ottomans into a subject of ridicule. The climax came in 1648, when his ministers finally reached their breaking point. Ibrahim was deposed by his own servants and strangled in captivity. His death was more than the end of a mad king. It was the closing act of a chapter where the harem reigned supreme over the fate of the empire. Yet the memory of this period, of fatal passions that transformed love into a weapon, haunted Ottoman history for centuries. If Suleiman and Hürrem had turned love into a turning point in history, then Ibrahim and his concubines transformed it into a pathway to ruin. And therein lies the paradox of the Ottoman harem. A realm of silk and gold, but also of ambition, lust, and betrayal, forces that quietly eroded the very foundations of an empire. In the legacy of the Ottoman Empire, few things are as haunting and dazzling as the tales of love and betrayal within the harem. They were never just idle gossip for later generations, but forces that dug deep roots into the very machinery of empire, reshaping politics, molding culture, and etching themselves into the collective imagination of both East and West. Looking back, we see that what seemed like private romances were never matters of the heart alone. They were delicate yet heavy chains tugging at the throne, shaking armies, and at times driving a mighty dynasty into decline. From the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, when the power of Hürrem Sultan flared like a crimson flame in the shadows, the harem began to shed its image as a mere garden of flowers for the empire. It became a political institution in its own right, a place where love was calculated, where an embrace could be as sharp as a blade. That shift opened an era in which every affair of the heart carried grave consequences, an era where passion was forced to wear the mask of ambition. For centuries afterward, the harem did not simply accompany Ottoman politics, it steered them. Its impact was never confined within palace walls. When an emperor's affection shifted from one concubine to another, entire political networks trembled. The fall of an empress consort meant her family would be cast from power. The rise of a favored consort could propel a wave of ministers, generals, and even foreign merchants into prominence. The harem became a chessboard where each move sent ripples across society, shaping trade, diplomacy, and even war. Yet the paradox was that this expansion of power made the empire increasingly fragile. When love is warped into a tool, it becomes a ticking bomb of instability. People loved to gain advantage, grew jealous to justify assassinations, and betrayed to survive. In the harem, betrayal was never a private wound, but a mortal strike that could unsettle the throne itself. And still, these wars of the heart repeated endlessly, a fatal cycle from which no one could escape. For this reason, when historians examine the empire's later decline, the harem cannot be ignored. It was not that women brought down the empire, but that once the harem evolved into a parallel center of power, fragmentation within the state was inevitable. Female influence, which burned brightest during the so-called Sultanate of Women, left behind a legacy both radiant and ruinous. It proved that women could become architects of power, yet also revealed how an empire could rip itself apart when passion and the throne became entangled. To understand this legacy, we must also consider how the harem has been reimagined in popular culture. From Turkish television dramas like Magnificent Century, where Hürrem Sultan and Suleiman embody both love and intrigue, to 19th century Western paintings and films that depicted the harem as a golden prison of sensuality and desire, its image has always fascinated. It is no longer only history, but a global cultural icon. In the European imagination, the harem once stood as a mirror reflecting both fear and longing for the Orient, a blend of exotic fantasy and unease. Curiously, art and storytelling often romanticize the harem, obscuring its brutality. We remember the banquets, the dances, the radiant beauties, yet seldom mention the women imprisoned their entire lives without ever seeing the sultan. We exaggerate fiery romances, but gloss over the quiet deaths in forgotten chambers. This romanticizing prolonged the myth of the harem, ensuring it remained vivid long after the Ottoman Empire itself had dissolved. And there lies the paradox. The harem was both paradise and prison. It was where ordinary women could rise to become the most powerful queens of the empire, yet also where they could be destroyed for a misplaced glance. It was where love was elevated into a political weapon, yet where love itself was stripped of its true meaning. The harem was a gilded cage, radiant, suffocating, and inseparable from power. As we reach the end of this journey through centuries of intrigue, we must ask, did love in the empire ever truly exist, or was it only a mask carefully draped over ambition? Behind every burning kiss, was there a whispered promise of power? Behind every tear, a dagger hidden in the sleeve? The Ottoman harem proved that love could shake the throne, but it also left us questioning whether love within the shadows of power could ever be pure. That legacy, like a ghost, still lingers in our imagination today. It forces us to face a bitter truth. In the world of empires, love was rarely a safe harbor. More often, it was simply another road to the throne. And perhaps that is the greatest tragedy the Ottoman harem bequeathed to history, a tragedy from which neither memory nor culture has ever truly escaped.